Dominic Raab's resignation has prompted a flurry of venom directed at British civil servants, and their so-called sensitivity is being blamed for pretty much everything. And now that includes the failure of Britain to evacuate people from Sudan.
It's not like this came out of nowhere. Trouble has been brewing. Even I know, and I have a passing knowledge of that part of the world, even I've been seeing on the world news pages that it's been getting a bit troublesome in Sudan. Why the hell was the ambassador and the deputy away? Now, if there's some vital job that has to be, the ambassador has to attend, okay, I get it. I would suggest, I'm assuming it's a he, I don't know. Can we find out who the ambassador to Sudan is, please? I think she had better stay there. Certainly you and the deputy don't come away. So who does that track back to again, John? Well, that would be the civil service. So I know, John, you're probably the sort of person who never shouts at anyone, and despite the fact that the stories you filed are utterly incorrect and you've cost this company millions of pounds and you're an incompetent, unprofessional, poor journalist, but don't worry, I'm going to embrace you and tell you you've done a fantastic job. The reality of life sometimes is a little different, and this could be a situation in which, because a few civil servants can't take the odd hard word without having to race off to the Priory and have a lie down in a darkened room, because they are those sort of people, we've got Brits stuck in Sudan. But as long as no one gets shouted at, because you wouldn't want to shout at anybody if you're trying to rescue people from possible death, would you?
So Nick Ferrari thinks people are stuck in Sudan because, quote, a few civil servants can't take the odd hard word without having to race off to the Priory and have a lie down in a darkened room. Now remember, this bashing of workers is only happening because Dominic Raab wants to blame someone else for him being found to have bullied his staff. And yes, of course, you might remember, that's the same Dominic Raab who himself stayed at the beach when Kabul in Afghanistan was being evacuated. So a much bigger screw up than is currently what we're seeing in Sudan. The failure to evacuate properly from Afghanistan. So many people who'd been working with the British military who we had a real direct responsibility to. Yes, we have a direct responsibility to people in Sudan as well, but there were many more in Afghanistan. That fuck up was because Dominic Raab was at the beach. Dominic Raab, who's now calling everyone else a snowflake. So why does Ferrari assume any failure is because staffers are too sensitive rather than simply our government being incompetent? Why? Could it be because he has an agenda to push? That agenda, of course, is demanding workers accept bullying and poor condition. And it's been pushed all weekend. The Telegraph published this. Dominic Raab's resignation is a victory for the work-shy civil service. Think what you like about the former deputy PM, but the broken bureaucracy is now undeniably failing Britain. That's from Camilla Tominey, associate editor at the Telegraph. This was Nigel Farage's take. I have no doubt that Raab was absolutely right to call the civil servant utterly useless. This woke, weak culture that sees him resign over such a thing explains why our country is in decline. Ash, what do you make of this? Following Dominic Raab resigning because he was found to have bullied a staff member, we're seeing this backlash from across the right, which is to say, oh, workers have it too good. Workers now are constantly complaining. They want to have time off work when they're having mental health problems. They don't want to get bullied by their bosses. This is the problem with society. It's people being too sensitive and people having too high expectations for how they should be treated in the workplace.
The first thing you've got to understand about political media especially is that it is stuffed to the gills with raging egoists who treat the people who work under them like they're total scum and think it's totally justified by their own prestige and status. So when you've got a story that somebody who they are politically in alignment with, because he's a conservative and you're a right-wing pundit or politician turned pundit like Nigel Farage, it speaks to all of your prejudices about, oh, they just can't handle someone who's really, really excellent. And they're all just too stupid and weak and inefficient, unlike me, Nick Ferrari. So I think it's something which plays to a lot of their prejudices. It's also part of a wider culture war narrative where it's millennials and Generation Z who are sensitive and unable to cope with the demands of the real world. Now, interestingly, when you look at the report into Dominic Raab's conduct, one of the things which is pointed out is that a lot of these allegations haven't come from inexperienced, fresh out of university civil servants. Lots of them had been working at quite senior levels for years. So this concoction of it's all just millennial snowflakes is an invention of government spin doctors essentially playing to the prejudices and the presumptions of a media class which doesn't value the truth more than they value their own hobby horses. And I also think that it connects to this kind of wider theme that we've been seeing when it comes to the likes of the Telegraph and lots of people who are at LBC and Nigel Farage and all them lot. We saw it when it came to this idea of lockdown, these workers need to be protected. Idiots from the deadly virus which is transmitted through the air. And the way in which they talk about working from home as though it's going to be the collapse of Western civilization. I think that they are just ideologically and implacably opposed to the idea that workers have rights and you can't ride roughshod over them, and that they're going to speak up when you treat them like crap. And I think there's also a kind of awareness that people's wages aren't going that far anymore. Everybody is noticing the impact of, eggs being 18% more expensive than they were a couple of months ago. And when you've got a context of, all right, pay is going down and people are in senior management roles and behaving in ways which are hostile or aggressive or rude or, micromanaging, they're not going to be able to get away with it in the same way, because you can't just go, oh, well, I get paid for it, it's fine. You're like, wait a minute, motherfucker, I don't even get paid enough for you to treat me this way. So I think that that's why they're kind of having this outsized reaction to the Dominic Raab stuff, because Dominic Raab stands in for every other crappy boss who is now, harassing and intimidating and haranguing increasingly underpaid staff.
I think we can summarize, right-wingers really hate the idea of there being consequences for bullying, for treating your workers badly. It turns out they also hate the idea of there being consequences for sexual harassment. Now, this is a story in the FT. Tougher UK legislation on workplace sexual harassment set to be shelved. More than 40 amendments by Tory backbench peers is likely to time out a private member's bill. Now, we should look in detail what the nature of that bill which Tory Lords has blocked is, and this is the context from the FT. The government first carried out a consultation on sexual harassment in the workplace nearly 4 years ago. In a response published in July 2021, ministers said they would impose a new proactive duty on employers to take all reasonable steps to prevent sexual harassment in workplaces in advance. Another change would be that employers would not only be responsible for preventing harassment from other colleagues, but also from customers and clients. And they say ministers had originally planned to include the policy in a broader employment bill, but that was dropped more than a year ago. Instead, they have given their support to a cross-party private members' bill led by Liberal Democrat MP Vera Hobhouse called the Worker Protection Amendment of Equality Act 2010 bill. So as you can see, there was going to be this big broad package of workers' protections. That got dropped. Now the government, instead of fallen in behind this private members' bill from a Lib Dem, but that's now being blocked by Tory backbenchers and Lords. The bare minimum now seems to be out of the window, and campaigners are outraged. So referencing the sexual harassment currently engulfing, or sexual harassment scandal, currently engulfing the CBI, so the Chamber of Business and Industry, the chief executive of the Fawcett Society said this: it's all very well the government saying they won't engage with the CBI while this is going on. What we should be seeing is a serious commitment to sexual harassment not happening, not being outraged when it does. They should be seriously getting behind the only serious legislative change we've seen in Britain come out of the Me Too movement. So she's saying this is the only serious change or legislative change that's come out of the Me Too movement. They should be getting behind it, not accepting it will fall. TUC General Secretary Paul Novak also is unimpressed. He says it would be utterly shameful if the government allows this bill to fall. Ministers promised to bring in new laws to tackle sexual harassment, but are now backsliding under pressure from backbenchers. Every day we hear stories about how endemic sexual harassment is in our workplaces, and we know many in public-facing jobs like shop workers and GP receptionists suffer abuse and harassment regularly from clients and customers. Rishi Sunak must not abandon vulnerable staff. These protections are essential. So they seem like fairly reasonable arguments to me being made there. But of course, this is being thrown out, or this is being blocked by Tory peers. Tory backbenchers are also opposed. But why? Why have they got such a problem with this bill? Well, the Telegraph reports this. Jacob Rees-Mogg, the former business secretary, said establishments that serve the public can expect to run a police state in their business. While Sir John Hayes, the chairman of the Common Sense group of Tory MPs, said it had, quote, sinister implications. Another Conservative MP, Craig McKinley, said he believed the change was draconian. And Lord Frost, the former Cabinet Office Minister, described the bill as a woke socialist measure that would have a chilling effect on every conversation in the workplace. Ash, the reason I put these stories together is I think you are seeing quite a similar thing, which is this backlash against workers expecting to be treated right in the workplace. So when it came to Dominic Raab, it was you don't want to be bullied by your boss. Here it's you want your bosses to have to put in due protections to protect staffers from sexual harassment. And in both cases, you've got all these right-wingers saying, no, workers should be able to be bullied by their bosses. And here, we can't have laws which protect people from sort of sexual harassment because that would be, in the words of this lord, woke socialism.
It makes you worry about what kinds of conversations these gentlemen are having in the workplace. If they think that new legislation to clamp down on sexual harassment in the workplace is going to mean that there's a police state monitoring every conversation in the office and that everyone's got something to fear. Now, obviously, something like sexual harassment is something that you've both got to take seriously and also not craft legislation so tightly that you end up, criminalizing reasonable behavior. But the fact is that for lots of people in lots of workplaces, they are left basically entirely unprotected to unwanted sexual advances, which are persistent enough to cause a problem. We're not just talking about a one-off or someone paying you a compliment that you don't like one time. We're talking about repeated advances. And I can give you a couple of examples. I remember when I was, at uni, working in a pub, it was a really common thing that you would stay late to close up. And it was very often me or another woman who worked behind the bar who would stay behind to close up because we were two of the most experienced bar staff on hand. And it happened to be in the run up to Christmas time, which everyone knows it's really, really busy and you get a lot of office parties in and people get very drunk. It happened to be my colleague who'd stayed behind to close up. We'd had an office party from one of the corporates across the road. And there had been a guy who had just been hitting on her and hitting on her and hitting on her, which isn't that unusual when you're working in a pub and people are drunk. And then he followed her home. So it was very late at night. She was by herself. She'd closed up the pub and he followed her home. And afterwards, she did what anybody would do. She reported it to the landlady of the pub and she said, look, I don't ever want to serve him again. I don't think he should be welcome here. And the message back from the landlady was, well, we make a lot of money from them. They're regular customers. They're, the office across the road, lots of them come here. We can't, we're not going to lose their business. And it was really shit. It was really shit that you could have this, egregious example of sexual harassment where it was putting somebody's safety at risk. She's being followed home at night. Anything could have happened. And the message was, okay, well, they're a customer. We rely on them for income. So, sorry, not going to take even the bare minimum steps to stop him from coming in here. What we ended up doing as bar staff is that we all just had an agreement not to serve him and never served him again. But there should be more pressure on an employer to go, okay, well, I have a responsibility to make sure that you don't experience that again, rather than, oh, you're on your own. And I think that that's not just in hospitality jobs where you see that kind of behavior. I think in lots of sales jobs, there's often a kind of unwritten code that the people who are trying to make the sale are part of the deal. You can harass them, you can make all sorts of advances. And again, it's something where if you introduce this kind of legislation, which puts a preventative responsibility on the employer, you can no longer have these kind of shady practices operating in plain sight. So I can see why the Conservatives are worried from their ideological pro-boss standpoint. It's because actually sexual harassment is baked in to a lot of worker-customer interaction. And they don't want the idea that the extraction of profit might be interrupted by something as basic as human decency.